Oh, here we go again, Robin. There's that ominous music. I love our theme song. Doesn't that sound great? I like it anyway. Anyway, folks, it's nice to see you and to some of you see us and to hear you, and we can hear you a little bit, perhaps, if you chime in with the chat. But I'm Dr. Dennis Becker, and I'm joined with my colleague Robin Golinski, and we have a special guest with us today who you'll meet just a couple of minutes. And as always, we're talking about manipulation, that wonderfully joyful topic of manipulation, and a different way to talk about it today. So we've got a guest joining us who talks about manipulation in a different tone than we've been. We've been focused on you and how you can protect yourself with the techniques that we've been teaching you to help you with the tactics that get used against you in manipulation. Today, a little bit different, similar just for you, and we'll try to adjust it to you as much as we can, but take from it what you can, what applies to your life and to the interactions that you're having with your manipulator. So it's a different perspective, but I think it's going to be very helpful to you. So welcome, Robin. And Robin, would you introduce our guest, please? And let's kick it off.
Yes, we have Michael Lee, who is the director of the Civility Initiative at the College of Charleston. And Michael, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, thanks for having me on the show. Like I said, I'm Michael Lee, director of the Civility Initiative at the College of Charleston. The Civility Initiative is dedicated to promoting dialogue across difference and healthy disagreement in a divided nation. And to that extent, we host panels, debates, speakers, film screenings. I host a podcast about memorable arguments in our lives called When We Disagree. That's widely available. But the two big areas that we work on with those panels or debates or the podcast or film screenings are fight and flight, as I've called them. So fight issues include kind of classic issues of antagonism or propaganda or manipulation, which are about violence, bigotry, cancellation, free speech issues, culture war issues, civil war issues, places where the culture is coming apart at the seams because we're at each other's throats so aggressively. The flight issues are a little bit more insidious. So if fight issues are about me coming at you a little too hard, flight issues are the opposite. It's me moving away from people that I share a marriage with, a household with, a community with, even a nation with. And so Americans are far less likely now to know the names, especially first and last names of their neighbors than we ever have been before. So we're both a nation that's coming apart at the seams because we're overly aggressive and antagonistic, but also because of flight, because of loneliness, isolation, alienation. And one of the key points that I've raised before that has been an experience I've had on the podcast is the podcast begins with the premise, have you ever been in a disagreement that really stuck with you, that you can't get out of your head? And then every episode, a guest comes on and tells the story of a memorable disagreement that they couldn't shake loose of for whatever reason. It could be professional, personal, philosophical, political, it doesn't matter. All that matters for the show is that it matters to you, the guest. But what I've focused on over 50-ish episodes, and I've tried to produce that many more to recruit people to come on the show, is that so many of us say we don't have any conflicts. So when I get into audiences or I speak at a retirement community or I speak at a student club and I say, how many of you have been in a disagreement that really stuck with you? I get lots of people saying, well, it's an interesting concept, but I don't have any to share. And my initial response is, there's no way.
Wow.
Maybe we
Wow.
should have you come on the show and talk about conflict avoidance or conflict suppression.
Right.
As your conflict style. And so what I'm seeing is not only maybe have they not been in one, although I think that's probably not true, but they don't want to admit that they are the type of person who would have A, had a conflict, and B, to remember the conflict well enough to come on a show and talk about that conflict.
I think if you're alive, there's no way to ever really avoid conflict unless you live in a bubble, right? If you're going to engage, interact, have relationships with other humans, navigate society, it's inevitable that you're going to have a conflict. So I'm fascinated with your perspective on that, particularly on that topic of people who say, oh, I've never really I never really have a conflict because
Yeah.
it reminds me of my grandma, actually. My grandma, when she learned to drive when she was 50, and she drove so carefully that you could just see the cars piling up, like her causing accidents wherever she went, but she wasn't in the accident. She drove perfectly, right? But, you know, these people who are supposedly conflict avoidant are
Yeah.
causing more problems because there's a lack of honesty there, and I'm sure many other reasons that you've learned. And we were fascinated with your podcast, and we're so happy to have you on because the intersection between what you do and what we're doing is its own vast rabbit hole, which
It really is.
yes, which I'm excited to go down.
So much
Michael,
of
do
what's
you
happening.
see a
Go
do you
ahead.
see a difference between conflict and disagreement? What's the difference?
Well, all disagreements are conflicts, but not all conflicts are disagreements,
Hmm.
would be the
Interesting.
distinction I
Oh,
draw there.
because it could just be conflict for conflict's sake.
Or it could be a violent conflict, which is not necessarily a verbal disagreement. And so
Ah,
Mhm.
conflict is the broader category, and disagreement is the larger one. We can think about, to some extent, sports as a kind of conflict, or of course, warfare as a kind of conflict, divorce as a kind of conflict. Disagreements being the volley of ideas or insults or emotions or facial gestures or rude hand gestures seems to me to be a subspecies of a type of conflict. At least
Would
that's
you
the way
say
I
that
approach it.
would you say, Michael, that conflict grows out of disagreement? Does one
well,
lead to the other?
disagreement is conflict, he said.
Yep. But what I'm
Yeah.
saying, people could disagree on things, but not stoop
But
to the
that is
level
a
of
form of
conflict.
conflict.
Yeah, this is, I guess what I would say is I have a different point of view on, I think some can, not all of the time. It's difficult to imagine some conflicts that didn't stem from a disagreement, although assuming how broadly we define conflict, if sports, for instance, or conflicts don't necessarily come out of a disagreement. Maybe we're disagreeing over who the best football team is on the field, and then we have a conflict in
Yeah,
football to settle
yeah,
that
yeah,
question. So
right,
maybe,
right. Yeah.
but the perspective I teach, and when I do this in schools or I do this in companies, if I go do training seminars on healthy conflict, what does healthy conflict look like? What does it look like to have a healthy but tough conversation? Is we start with a framework of, there's kind of four approaches to dealing with conflict broadly and disagreement generally. And this can be true in your relationship, this can be true in your family, this can be true at your university, or certainly true at your company, which is the first one is that conflict is bad and needs to be avoided. Conflict, second, is a nuisance and needs to be endured. Like traffic, right?
Mhm.
Conflict, third, conflict is inevitably explosive, which seems to go to your point, Dennis, inevitably explosive and needs to be settled. So we can't have a kind of lingering disagreement. We got to settle this thing right here, or we're basically just juggling grenades.
Mm.
Or the fourth point of view, and the one that I happen to favor, is that conflict is productive and needs to be embraced, especially productive as a change agent, especially productive as a way for people to feel seen and potentially validated, and especially productive in terms of a relational dynamic so that there's a relatively equal balance of power.
Well, that's a beautiful thing, but that requires some sophisticated skills on both sides, right? Of active listening, listening as though your mind could be changed, perhaps paraphrasing, not nonverbal control, so that even though I'm maybe know the right things to say or the things that are helpful to say, I could be nonverbally showing contempt or disgust or something like that. So
Yeah, I don't have any objection to any of that, except I would say that I think that it's learnable, teachable.
I
I think
agree with
those
you.
are maybe very specific kinds of skills, but not sophisticated to the point where the entry barrier is very high. I don't think it's an impossible burden to ask of people. I also think many of us in our close relationships do these things automatically. We may not even
Yes.
realize that we're doing them, but in loving, caring relationships, when we don't feel like our safety or our physical security or the relationship is on the line, I can reflect back to you fairly equally. I can show curiosity about what you're saying. I can give you a charitable interpretation of what I think your motivations are, and so forth. All of the things that we associate with healthy conflict, are things we all do. We just need to do them more and in different relationships when we feel unsafe during disagreements, especially.
Yeah, I know what you're saying. And it's amazing how much society has changed over the last 10, 15 years, where it's ironic to me that there's all this talk of tolerance, 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 tolerance.
Right.
And yet we're incredibly intolerant of a different opinion. It doesn't make any sense to me. It's like we're talking out of one side of our mouth and then we're doing something exact opposite. Like you mentioned free speech and tolerating differing points of view and respecting. That's what America was supposed to be all about, right? That you could have civility, civil discussions.
Well, if I pick up on that for just a moment, I want to spin there a little bit, Robin. I hope our listeners remember the name Jack Welch. Perhaps you know Jack Welch. He was the head of General Electric for a long, long time, a very outspoken guy. He built his whole philosophy of doing business on the idea that conflict is good. And in fact, he would say he'd pit one department against the other department to see who came out with a better idea or whatever. And his whole thought was that conflict is a good thing, and disagreement, so what? As long as the product that comes out in the end is a good thing, who cares who suffers more or less? And there are all kinds of examples of that. How do you deal with that, Michael?
Oh, wait, I want to tag on to that before Michael answers, because you and I just listened to the history of Microsoft, in which they had ranked people and they had somebody always had to be at the bottom of a department. And that was very bad. It really harmed morale in their culture. So I would just add that to the mix. And I would say that's the same mindset that Gates had with his people. Oh, and it's in some ways that's a very American thing too. Survival of the fittest, may the best man win and all those.
Yeah.
So
conflict, Michael?
I guess I would distinguish between healthy and unhealthy approaches to conflict. So let's say in an organization where there's a culture both of innovation, but also necessarily a culture of membership, of feeling like you belong and that your contributions are valued. And if we go too far down the competition is good route, we could end up in this kind of strict but cruel meritocracy where somebody must be first and necessarily somebody must be last, and everybody else needs to know their number. Therein, difficult for me to imagine a scenario in which the bottom quartile of employees feel valued enough to continue to try to innovate, right? It would chill their own expressions as well.
Absolutely.
So it ends up being kind of self-defeating. So we're always about balancing two values against one another. What I'm reacting very strongly to is a culture that values safety over resilience, of false peace over the promise of conflict. False peace meaning the absence of conflict is therefore peace. And that is what I mean by
that is beautiful. Can you repeat that? I think that is very, very, very important.
Yeah.
Say that one more time.
Making that kind of like logical mistake where an absence of conflict is peace, and that is a false peace, if I can repeat it by paraphrase.
False peace, P-E-A-C-E, false peace. For those of you who are not English speakers, I don't want you to get confused with the homonym. That is so true.
So to your Welsh example, I can think of other examples. That doesn't sound like the best one, but I don't know a lot about it, so I don't want to weigh in on the culture of GE and make wild aspersions. But I would say that we do have lots of examples of productive and innovative forces. There's plenty of investment firms that run their investment portfolios via debate and disagreement, where if there's a potential risk opportunity, then one side will go out and research one side, the other side researches the other side, have a competition and an educated series of judges, and make the best guess we can in terms of the probability of risk and reward in this particular investment. In terms of idea generation, it's also true. Doris Kearns Goodwin wrote the famous book Team of Rivals about Lincoln's cabinet. And so, of course, we embrace this kind of conflict. And the reverse is also a stagnating society where you surround yourself with yes people to where there is no new idea that can be introduced that contradicts the orders
Yeah.
the boss. And that's certainly a stifling, stagnant environment that nobody
Yeah.
wants to
Yeah.
live in,
Yeah.
whether in a relationship or in a corporate culture or in a political society.
One of the things that we deal with when in manipulation with a lot of the folks that we're working with is the idea of avoidance. Since we mentioned that, they want to avoid conflict with a manipulator who might say something that they may disagree with internally, but are
And they
afraid to
also
say
use the
anything.
word confrontation, Dennis.
Oh,
Like, I want to
confrontation.
avoid confrontation.
Yes, yes, right. At all cost. And so they wind up going along with whatever the manipulation happens to be. And sometimes, not sometimes, it's almost always 2 or 3 or 4 things happening at the same time in terms of manipulative tactics. But they want to avoid the confrontation with that person. And they certainly want to avoid conflict, even though they may live in a world of personal disagreement. They still go along with it. How do you help
Well, they
somebody
end up
like that?
internalizing the conflict, which
What do you
erodes their
do?
own well-being.
You have any suggestions
Yeah.
there, Michael?
Well, there's a lot of great literature on this, the interpersonal literature, especially in the psych world. The kind of 4 key hallmarks of relational disillusion from the
Ooh, I
research
like that.
of the Gottmans. And the Gottmans like to talk about these 4 argumentative horsemen: criticism, contempt, defensiveness, and stonewalling. And saying I'm the only person who can be confrontational and you can't, or if
Mhm.
you are confrontational with me, that means, or critical of me, that means you're being disloyal to me, is a kind of
Mhm.
manipulative attempt. So if we go through all of them, an overly
Mhm.
critical environment in which I criticize you but can't be criticized in turn, and an environment in which I'm deeply contemptuous of your contributions but accept no contempt in return. Defensiveness, if I'm ever faced with even the mildest version of your criticisms or your true thoughts on the matter, to then turn tables and make it about you. And then finally, the ice out strategy, the cold shoulder strategy, which is
Mm.
stonewalling, which is to say, fine, you're not even going
Yeah.
to get a nice word out of me, much less contempt
Yeah.
out of
Yeah.
me. All of those, I would say, to your question, what can we do? Number one, be mindful of the strategies of the manipulator.
Yeah.
And these are the 4 most studied of those strategies, at least in this particular section of literature. So be mindful and know stonewalling when you see it. And that's not necessarily about you. The manipulator, the abuser wants to make this about you, but it's not about you. It's about them.
Mhm.
Yes, it's easier said than done, of course, because then you have to deal
Yeah.
with backlash, and you
Oh,
have to
yeah.
start to see backlash as success instead of as punishment, and you need to retreat and adapt,
Yeah.
changing your behavior to what the manipulator wants, which is what everyone's worst fear is. And of
Yeah.
course, when they use tactics like public humiliation, I remember the Amber Heard thing with Johnny Depp.
Right.
I was really struck by her story that she was telling, and I didn't watch the whole thing, but this one thing really stuck with me, which was she was talking about being on a private jet with him and his friends, and he had been drinking and drugging and whatever, and that he kicked her really hard because he was angry at her. And her first thought was hoping that nobody saw it.
Oh,
And it was so telling
Mm.
of how he had a grip on her, that it wasn't her own safety, it wasn't her care for herself, but embarrassment, public humiliation, which is such a huge weapon.
yeah.
And
And,
it
and physical
really,
abuse, which
Yeah.
is a different
Yeah.
animal.
yeah.
Yeah.
And just
Yeah.
as long as nobody sees it, I
Right.
guess it's not real unless somebody sees it, or if somebody sees it, they're going to blame her, or she's going to look bad. I don't know. It's just such a warped way to think once you
Yeah.
get into that mode.
Yeah. And I don't know her or the story, but I also know that it's possible to know that if there's something really public and really visible, that
Mhm.
means it's something that you have to deal with
Yeah.
because other people saw it.
Look,
And
there
so
you
not wanting
go.
it to be public, wanting it to be secret or behind closed
There
doors
you go.
Yep.
can also be a way to avoid having to confront something that other people see the innate injustice of.
That's right. And that's
Yeah.
often the kind of thing that we're dealing with, because manipulators can be very secretive about it, and yet they're very controlling. So it doesn't really escalate to the
Yeah.
public eye. So it's hard to sort of reflect or even react sometimes, but they're very, very controlling.
Well,
And
they've
it makes it
done
difficult.
studies on this with teenage girls and their
Mm.
bullying, how it goes right under the radar of all the administrators because it's so nuanced and so subtle. And the girls have codes and they know that this side look or just a turn of the shoulder or whatever is worth 1,000 words. And it's very difficult. I mean, the only thing I think that we can do is continue to try to enlighten and awaken people so they can police their own right to not have this happen.
It feels very much like, there's a very famous book called Amusing Ourselves to Death about the media that Neil Postman wrote. And he begins with a story about, we usually think of power in a kind of top-down 1984 sense. We're going to live potentially in a totalitarian society because some outside force has come in and now they control us and now power flows from them down to us. But what if the reverse is true and that we have a lot more power than we think? And that's the Brave New World idea from Aldous Huxley, that we are creating our own set of prisons, right? We are putting the chains on ourselves.
Absolutely.
So power doesn't necessarily flow exclusively from the manipulator to the manipulatee, where they have all the agency and we have none, but we also accede to their view of the world through conflict avoidance or through a lack of confrontation, or because in this case, because we have given power over to popular people and concede and agreed to play their game of who is popular and who is not, of these cold shoulders and these side eyes mean the world to me because I'm in 8th grade, but they don't necessarily have to.
Right.
It even goes through the greater public with movie stars, being worshipped as perfect idols who I don't know, I guess they don't go to the bathroom, they don't sleep, they don't, get sick. They're just perfect. And it's it's each person has to look at how they're thinking and really get underneath from that. And that's very similar to what we talk about is, you can't be manipulated unless you're compliant with the manipulation. And a lot of people will just flat out say to me, I'm not ready for that. I can't do that. Because once you know it, you can't unknow it. So once you're made aware of your actions, like you said, your power, saying, your choices, then you have responsibility that goes with that. And some people, think that avoiding that is going to make their life easier, and it won't.
Let's for a moment, I'm going to bring this to a very, very real scenario. Let's say that you're confronted by someone on the street and they attack you. Now we're talking about physical violence now, Michael. They attack you. Are we in a different world when we're talking about this kind of a thing? Now we're talking about physical self-defense as opposed to other kinds of conflict. Is this a different kind of a thing? It stands alone and you have to learn those physical defense things as opposed to other ways of dealing with conflict and disagreement?
I mean, you can't very well ignore or not attend to getting punched. And so to your hypothetical scenario, I would also say the same thing is true about abuse, non-physical, emotional, psychological abuse in a manipulative, domineering kind of relationship, aside from the hypothetical, which is to say that we can be defined by that which we give our attention to. And so if I find myself
another great quote
consistently scrolling through celebrity gossip, to some extent that becomes part of my identity. I am somebody who consistently attends to the makings and shakings of celebrities. If I'm doing
you're marinating yourself in it. Yes.
Yeah. And so I would say, and this has a limit, but I would say that if you are a person who attends to a corporate culture of toxicity when it's not compulsory, then that can grow to define you. If you are a person who is overly attentive to your partner and your partner's needs in a relationship, when that person is not equally as attentive to your needs, then that is a problem necessarily of attention too, not just them being a bad partner. That's a dynamic that you're co-creating. And so with somebody accosting you on the street, if you can walk away, of course, you don't have to be defined by what they want, which is your attention. Attacking is a different matter, and also one that is illegal. Yelling something at somebody on the street isn't.
How about those confrontations? I'll use the word carefully here because it may not mean exactly what we're talking about, but the confrontation that occurs in a bar room or at a party where someone's in your face about something political or some issue that they're strongly disagreeing with you, and if not handled properly, could end up in somebody getting a punch in the mouth or whatever. How do you deal with disagreements when you're having them live like that? What's the best way to deal with that?
A few things, and I do workshops on this, but a few things. One is to understand that persuasion is relational and not event-based. And so if you really want to engage and that person is in a position where they seem persuadable, and so you have a moment and you would like to engage them, then engage them, but without the hope that at the end of that conversation, they're going to change their mind. And with the idea that perhaps you'll follow up on that attempt at persuasion, if it's something that means that much to you. Second, find some curiosity, right? They have a kind of vociferous opinion about this thing, and they're in your face about this thing. And maybe that's because they're just innately passionate about the thing they're talking about, or maybe there's a deeper motivation that is familial, that is relational, that is personal or psychological. And so finding out why they feel so strongly about that thing is important for your own curiosity so that you don't just distance yourself. Third, don't get into the facts. We always think that facts are going to be our savior, but we all know very quickly that
Not with irrational people. They're not.
and even, reasonable people can disagree about lots of things, because sometimes the
Yes.
hardest thing in the world to do, philosophically or scientifically, is to figure out what's true. And so, yes, of course, we see the world differently, and the more irrational we are, the harder it is to come to a point of common factual agreement. But reason is not perfect, and reasonable people can find really complex issues about which to disagree. But if we can establish a value-based commonality, right? Maybe that's a commonality because you and I both like jazz music or love the Philadelphia Eagles. And then we can work backwards from our common pursuits and our common humanity to a place of where we can be comfortable in conflict, or specific to the conflict itself. Somebody's hot in your face about the upcoming election or something going on at the border or something going on overseas. What is the value that you think is motivating their opinion? So I hear that you're concerned about international security. So I hear that you're concerned about how much money the American government is spending here, there, and elsewhere. So I hear that you're concerned about predictability about who's coming into the country. That is something that I can agree to. I can agree that we should all be concerned about that thing. And now let's work on how we can mutually achieve that objective, that value.
It's interesting thing, Michael, one of the things that you said there was the second one you listed, curiosity, is something that Robin and I have been sharing with folks for a long time on a manipulative level. When they say something to you that is like accusing or attacking in some way or another, one of the first things we suggest that you do is tap into the curiosity. Why do you say that? What is it that makes you think that? Or what kinds of things have brought you to that conclusion, or whatever? Similar to what you were just suggesting, I think, Michael. And it absolutely works with manipulation, because now sometimes, even in a bar room, never mind what you just, you're going to get that kind of a person who you cannot approach with reason, and they're just out of the potential of reasoning. So sometimes we get that, but curiosity, I agree with you that curiosity and asking a question of the value that person has in the commentary that they're making is a very good approach. I agree with it. I like it.
If you can do it without the snark, which takes a little practice.
No, what makes you think that?
That's
whoa, that's not the right way.
Yeah, because that's like gasoline.
Yeah. And you could, I think we can balance those two. I don't think you have to have the most perfect poker face. If you're saying something I don't agree with, maybe I have a kind of furrowed brow or a skepticism. But I can also approach you if you disagree and say, give me your best shot. Convince me. What's the best case you can possibly
make? Offering, an invitation.
And I'll hear it. I'll hear it out. Yeah, invite. I'm inviting myself to be persuaded by your best case. I might furrow my brow while you're making the case. I'm not going to just pretend like I agree, but I will listen.
Spoken like a true debate coach right there.
Yeah. Right. In the days that I did debate coaching as well, that was one of the favorite tactics, of course. But with manipulation, the interesting thing with this, Michael, is that with manipulators, if you do that one time, 2, 3 times maybe, they basically give up because manipulators are all about control. And they want it easy. They want to do it. If you put up a resistance of, let's call it a resistance of curiosity, you put that out there, they're eventually going to say, yeah, and they go away. And they look for somebody who is an easier target. So from our perspective, curiosity is one of the greatest things that you can use to protect yourself. But it's the kind of curiosity that we're talking about right now. Sincere without snark. Yeah, very good.
Yeah, these are good piece of advice in terms of don't be a mark.
Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah. Well, for
Don't be a
manipulators,
mark.
we're all marks for manipulators. They're always looking. They're
Can we be
always
frank about being a
Oh.
mark?
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah.
That was good.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, we're at time.
Yep.
I feel like we could just talk about this forever. Great quotes from you,
Yeah.
Michael. I don't know if you're on Twitter, but they were tweetable. Tweetable quotes.
I'm on Instagram at When We Disagree, and you can find the podcast at When We Disagree. And I appreciate y'all's time. It's an honor to be here.
Well, we recommend you listen to Michael's podcast because it's really interesting. And of course, hearing first person narratives and their perspectives is really helpful. You always learn something. And there's always more to learn. That's the thing I love about communication. We're never going to be perfect. And there's probably another conflict waiting for you before the day is over.
So embrace it. Embrace it.
That's right.
Well, Michael Lee, thank you very much for being with us today. Don't forget the podcast, When We Disagree. So look it up, search for it. You're going to enjoy it. It will be very helpful to you, as we hope our podcasts are to you as well here on Outwit the Manipulator. So as we always say when we near the end, the old clock on the wall tells us it's time to say goodbye. So for my colleague, Robin Golinski, I'm Dr. Dennis Becker. Thanks for listening.